Quick question. Can your supervisors communicate, solve conflicts, lead with confidence? Anyone promoted from operations to management will tell you that the soft skills are the hard skills. That's why we created a program for technically minded folks to learn the right tools for today's leadership challenges. Tools like reading employee emotions, setting workplace goals, and communicating with a diverse workforce. Hungry for more? Get the details at shiftworkplace.co/supervisory leadership training. That's shiftworkplace.co/supervisory leadership training. Hello, Culture and Leadership Connections podcast listeners. I am really thrilled today to bring to you Chris Marhefka, who is going to talk to us today about a topic I'm keenly interested in, which is about men, men's development, men's health, and men coming to terms with who they are in a way that feels right for them. And Chris facilitates transformation by opening hearts, expanding minds, giving people permission to be their most authentic self. And he creates life-changing experiences in emotional healing, inner child work, somatic experiencing, breath work, masculine embodiment, relationship and communication coaching, men's development, and leadership mentoring, which is a really great list. And Chris is the CEO and facilitator at Training Camp for the Soul, which he created and then founded the Embodied Man community and retreats. And this came after a decade of personal work and coming to terms with his own issues and then finding some things that really helped not only him, but many other men at the same time. So I'm very interested to hear the story. Chris, I hope I got that more or less right.
That was amazing introduction. Thank you.
I'm glad you liked it, and I'm really happy to welcome you to our podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for this.
Great. So tell us a little bit more about you and yourself and help us to get to know you a bit better.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, that sums up where I am now. How I got here was a product of me trying to find myself, honestly. I was trying to find my place in the world, what I was here to contribute, what I wanted to build my legacy around. And so for the majority of my life, I was buying the story that was creating business and wealth and community. And I did that in different industries. And I started doing so much personal development, and I was growing during my first, decade of post-college adultship. And I was growing a lot, and I was reading all the books, and I was listening to hundreds of podcasts. And what I found, though, is that as I was growing and as my clients were growing, because I started coaching as well about 12 years ago, myself and my clients kept bumping up against the same challenges. And the more habits I added and the more practices I put into my life, it was always helpful, but it never actually solved the problem. I always use the analogy. It felt like my whole career as an entrepreneur and building businesses and growing teams was all about trimming weeds. I was just putting out the fire that was in front of me. I wasn't actually pulling those weeds out at the root. I was just trimming them until I found really the work that I'm doing today, which was going a little bit deeper than what I used to call mindset work or coaching based on habits and strategies. Those are all really useful. And for me, it was just, I was always a seeker. I was always very growth oriented, and I tried a lot of different things. I think that's why I feel really confident about what I'm doing now is I've tried a lot of different modalities, and I use a lot of them in what I do today. And it's really just a culmination of well over a decade of my own work and then work with hundreds and actually thousands of clients at this point.
Great. That's super. And I'm going to be asking you a lot more questions about that. But let's start with your childhood. Can you share a couple of incidents from your childhood that you think made you into that person that you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. I love starting with that question. It's actually a lot of the work that I do is diving into what we learned in childhood and the patterns that we picked up, the conditioning that we picked up. And my conditioning was a lot from my father's side was hard work. It was, the story was to be successful in life, whatever your definition, you just have to work hard. The gift of that for me was that everything that I did I was the hardest worker. Every sports team I was on, I wasn't always the most skilled, but I was always the most fit. I was always on time. I was always the last one to leave practice. Same thing in school. I worked hard and I did really well. And in business, I worked hard. I got to the point to where I was working 80 to 100-hour work weeks, building multiple companies. And it was just all about hard work. Now, that's the gift side, is I learned that lesson of what it means to really go all in on something. Now, the shadow of that, which I was living in for a long time, was that it was burning me out in more ways than one. That hard work was also married with the story of suffering, is that life was hard. And there was some level of what I was taught, that to be successful, you have to give up something. You have to compromise your life in some way. And so if you want this, you have to give up these other things. And so while I had an amazing childhood, I had a mother that taught me unconditional love. She was a stay-at-home mom. She really raised us. And then dad was that example of going out and working and bringing home the money. And for him, that story of working really hard led to him compromising a lot of the family time that I think to this day, we talk about it now. We have a much deeper relationship, but I think he regrets a little bit of it. And he was just playing out the story that was taught to him by his father and his father before that. And so, yeah, I was a really hard worker in everything that I did. I played every sport, and I got good enough at every sport just because I worked hard. And that was really the definition of me up until really just a few years ago, when I really started shifting the shadow of it and realizing that I can work hard when I want to and I feel really called to. And it's also not necessary to suffer to have the life that I want.
So those are really great insights, but I'm really more interested in specific incidents.
Oh, cool.
I would like to hear about an incident from your childhood, an incident from your adolescence, something that really marked you positively or negatively.
Yeah, I remember one really, really clearly. I was probably in my early, maybe 12, 13 years old. And I was a really competitive soccer player. And it was the moment when I got cut from my first team. It was like a really competitive track. And these were like people that I'd been playing with for years, and some were friends. And I remember I got cut from this team, and I could see the disappointment in my father. And it was the first time where I really felt like I let myself down. I let him down. And after that moment, I committed, and this was like really like the pivotal time in my development. I committed that I was never going to fail because of something that I did or my effort. And I remember it so vividly. And then, next year I ended up making that team.
So the message was that you had to be perfect, and that you could never come second. And that if you did come second, it made you into a loser. There's one winner, and if it's not you, then you lost.
Exactly. And I really have to stress that wasn't explicitly communicated. That was just the story that I created.
It never is. It never is explicitly communicated.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, well, that's a really good example. What about when you got older, or even something when you were younger, something that you feel really defined you? It may be something that you moved away from, or something that you moved closer to.
There was an incident that this one, I think, really defined how I trust others and I worked with others. And it happened right around, ironically, it's around soccer as well. I was around 5, though. This is when I was first starting and playing on like a little kid's soccer team. And the experience that I had was practice ending and all the parents coming to pick up their kids. And I remember standing by the coach, and everyone was like, "Oh, happy to see parents." And I remember this feeling of everyone being gone and dad wasn't there to pick me up. And meanwhile, the accuracy of what was happening was he just had turned around and watched my sister play on a field over, no more than 50 feet away, but I didn't see him. And he just thought it was 5 minutes earlier. And so 5 minutes go by, he comes back, and to him and to coach, everything's fine. And at that moment, there was a level of, I still remember this feeling of like contracting and thinking that other people aren't going to be there for me. Like it was that moment where the innocence of childhood was lost for me. And I realized like, oh, I have to take care of myself. And that was, again, the story that I created was that I can't quite trust others fully. And that story played out throughout my life in relationships. It played out in when I was leading teams and managing people. I would trust people a little bit, but never truly and deeply. And so that one experience shaped a lot of the way that I allowed people into my life. And I always felt like I was on an island. I felt like I was by myself, like I had to do things for myself, like I always had to be the one to do them. And it all stemmed from that one incident.
And probably other domino effect incidents that came afterwards.
Yep.
But it's interesting how you never really know what you're going to remember from your childhood. And parents don't know either. And something that might have been innocent, like what you were talking about there, that would be lived by the child as a trauma. When the parent would be completely unaware of it, and something that the parent might feel guilty about for years, you'd go, no problem. I don't know what you're talking about.
Exactly. Yeah. It's because the kids, they're in imagination land. They're literally creating a story of the world and their life, like on the fly. And they take the data that they get and they create it. And so
within the narrow confines of their small experience.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And which is, a lot defined by the parents and the community and the close family that you grow up in. And and it's crazy. Like another kid having that same experience, like right next to me, it could have been no big deal. But like for me in that one moment with my experience, it shaped a lot of the way that I saw things. And then after that, like you said, there's other dominoes. The mind just starts seeking for evidence to support that. And of course it finds it every time.
Of course. What's that saying? If you think you can, or if you think you can't, you're right.
You're right.
Yeah. I forget who said that, but it's great. So let me ask you another question. Culture. So everybody's born into a family. They're born into a race, a region, an ethnicity, heritage, family background, languages, can be a religious context. So all of those things shape who we are because it's got a group context in which we feel that we belong or belong less or belong not at all, but we still see it. So from those groups that you're born into, what would you say has really influenced your sense of culture and self right now?
One of the things that I'm really grateful for is that I was raised in a culture of family values. Both my mom's side and dad's side, we all lived in the same area. I recall family gatherings of 50 plus people regularly. And we always had really close relationships with our cousins. And family was always a priority, meaning that we went out of our way to go to the family gatherings and we wouldn't miss like a Christmas with them. And to this day, I'm really grateful for it because during my 20s and even my early 30s, I found myself like going off on my own to find myself. And now that I've done a lot of work, I find myself coming back and really appreciating family. Like now I have 4 beautiful nephews that I truly love, and I truly love spending time with them. And I look forward to creating my own family and then recreating those family gatherings with my sisters and my cousins. That was like one of the things that defined my whole early childhood life was the value of a family and really just a focus on, even though I don't think there were a lot of displays of it, but there was a focus on just being happy, like enjoying the simple things in life. Even though there was a lot of talk about a desire to be financially successful, I also saw a lot of examples of just going out and playing in the yard and playing catch with all the cousins or playing a game of touch football in the backyard with the whole family. It felt like a really, really simple life. And I find myself coming back to that now and appreciating like the really simple things in my life, like just going for a walk now, that when I was in my like head down mode of building, like I lost sight of those things.
Let me ask you a couple more questions that came up from what you just said. So when you talked about your nephews, I think people underestimate the importance of being an uncle or an aunt. Being an uncle can be absolutely the most important relationship that many young boys have, like having an uncle that cares about them or having an aunt that cares about them. And the same thing with girls. But when you talked about how important it was to connect with your nephews, I think I can really see that. I have 4 grandsons and the relationship that the spouses have with the boys is really significant. And we have a number of pictures of them looking at each other with so much love in each other's eyes that you can just see that there's a lot of admiration and support on both sides, from the adult to the child and the child to the adult. And it's really touching. And I think that that's really a gift that you're giving to those nephews that you have and that you experienced probably from all those times when you had extended family around and you were connecting with those people. You probably learned those skills as a child.
Yeah, absolutely. I did. And I really do believe that the old saying that it takes a village to raise a child. I really do believe in that. And I think in a lot of ways, our culture has unfortunately gotten away from that because the parents are only one example for the child and they have the most important role. But like you said, like the aunts and the uncles in a lot of more traditional cultures play a really large role in the raising of kids. And so I actually made a commitment about 2 years ago to really show up because in my life, it was so much easier to be selfish and to go on the fun trips. And I wasn't going out of my way to see my sisters and the boys as they were growing up. And I made a commitment 2 years ago to shift that. And I think for me, it was the first time where I shifted my thinking from very individualistic, like all about me and what I'm doing, to taking care of others and showing up for the collective. And I think that happens for a lot of people when they have their own kids. I don't have any kids yet. I think it just forced into it when you now have this thing outside of yourself that you are responsible for. So I made a conscious decision to do that. And, I had a lot of great examples of it when I was growing up. Yeah, I just want to pay that forward and just share both the fun and the joy and the playfulness and the adventure, but also just the learning and the skills and just the different perspectives that I have than my sisters or their spouses have.
It's really important. My sister never had children, and when she supported my kids, and they really appreciated that relationship, even though she didn't live close by, she was always thinking of things she could do to connect with them. And I think it had such a formative effect. This is nothing I experienced because I grew up in a family with no relations around. So it was doubly interesting for me to watch how that played out. The other question I had from your story about your childhood with your extended family was when you say you're with the cousins in the yard playing touch football, was that with all the cousins, boys and girls, or just the boys playing touch football?
All of them.
Cool.
All of them. Ironically, we had at my age level, there was only two, myself and then one other cousin, and then the rest were all female. Ironically, a lot of the grandkids now are all male, which I don't know how that happens in genetics, but yeah, so I actually grew up with a lot of women in my extended family and also in my immediate family as well. So yeah, it was everybody. And it wasn't just the touch football. We used to put on plays and we would choreograph musicals together. It was a lot of, it was so much fun. We did all of the
Sounds great.
things. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The reason I ask that is because it really varies from family to family. In some families, it's really divided by gender. In other families, it isn't. So yeah, it's interesting. I have a young friend who's in their extended family, boys and girls together. They're always playing soccer together, like always. And then they'd have the aunts, the uncles, the grandparents, everybody, and all the little kids. That was their family activities. Get together, they would always play soccer. And I thought, wow, isn't that cool that multi-age and then all across all genders, everyone was participating in that whole soccer experience. So I imagine it would have been like that for you for pretty much anything that you guys decided to do.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. It was. And it was all ages too, all the way up to the parents and the older cousins, all the way down to the younger ones. Yeah, everyone was involved. Mm-hmm.
So cool. So other than family, was there any other groups that you feel really influenced who you are?
I was raised in a conservative Catholic household. What I took from that today was just a commitment to values. I never got really interested in the religious aspect of it, but I really loved, again, the community of it. And then also the commitment to values, just something that's greater than self. And then outside of that, teams, the sports teams that I played on throughout my life were really, really influential for me. I mean, most of my best friends came out of the sports that I played with. I believe that I learned a lot about leadership and connection with others and communication with others just through playing sports and it being a necessity, just learning how to interact with my peers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. You learn body confidence, you learn interaction confidence, you learn to pick up on cues. A lot of things happen when you're playing on teams. So then you grew up and you chose to belong to different groups, defining it as any group. Two people together within seconds are already starting to establish norms of their interactions together, which becomes part of their culture. So any group that you chose to belong to as you grew up, what would you say you've adopted into your leadership style? You said you went to college. Could be that, could be groups of friends. It could be exposure to other cultural groups or languages. Might have been if you lived in another country or, anything like that. You might have joined something that was not a sports group that you learned from that made you into a more rounded person because you had a wider experience.
Yeah, one of the experiences that I think really shaped my adult life was the experience I had in college. I was highly involved in student government, and I got involved as the president of a fraternity. And there's a lot of things that were immature about 20-something-year-olds and 18-year-olds in college. But also, I really always share that it taught me a lot about responsibility of self, responsibility of things, and then also responsibility of others as well and with others. And so that was like when I started stepping into those roles of leadership in college, it really, really challenged me. And I think what I took out of it was that's when my relationship to trust really started to shift. I think that is really when you asked about like the culture of what I bring into my relationships and communities now, I think that would be the number one thing that I would speak to is trust and integrity. There's just so much that's withheld between two people or in organizations or between managers. And I find that when you just share openly, you be honest with what's there, it breeds so much more trust and connection. And that is my experience in college is when I started to do that. I started to do it with like my executive team, and we would just be honest, be like, look, I'm really frustrated about this. And everyone would be like, oh my God, I'm so frustrated too. Thank you for bringing it up. And it's just like we can all feel these different energies in the room and these elephants in the room and this tension and this and that. And it happens with relationships. It certainly happened with mine. And then I realized at some point, it started then and then throughout my life, I just realized, just say what's on your, say what's on your heart, say what's on your mind, speak honestly about things, be honest about things. And every time I did it, the mild discomfort in the moment was so little compared to the level of connection and depth of the relationship after that point. And so I make it a point now, every single relationship or culture or community that I'm involved with, I bring that. I try to be the example of that.
I guess people would call that being vulnerable.
Vulnerable, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people speak about it that way. Being willing to be authentic would be another way of looking at it. So this sort of shift from I can't trust anybody. If I say what's on my mind and heart, that increases the trust rather than decreasing the trust. Instead of you working from a mask and them working from a mask, you both take your masks off. And you can actually see the expressions on each other's faces.
I love that.
So let's go to your temperament and your personality. So temperament being what you're born with. And then you may have also been affected by the environment that you were in. Sometimes hard to separate the two. And but then your personality is the result of obstacles you've overcome and opportunities you've taken. So what were you born with? And what did you add on or build into to become your personality? So when people say, oh yeah, Chris, he's been like that since he was 2, what would that be?
Other than hard work, which I definitely touched on, likable, generally likable. And what it was for me was, I think either I was born with or I learned this ability to adapt to a lot of different groups. Some people would call it like a chameleon-like personality. Again, the gift of that is that I was never really in cliques. I could always get along well with just about every group. I could relate with a lot of people. I could have a conversation with many different types of people with different interests. And the shadow of that I've definitely been shifting over the years is that it leads to loss of self. I can say honestly that I really struggled to find my true identity until the last few years. I was always seeking for it, but it was because I was always trying to please others and be like other people wanted me to be. It was keeping me from my most authentic expression of me, which honestly, I believe now is one of my greatest gifts. So that was definitely it. Is like very likable, very, very happy, very joyful. I was always a little bit of adventure, a little bit of troublemaker. I like walked a really fine line between slightly breaking the rules, even from a really young age, but never so much that it like really upset anyone. I would just like to test and push the edges. That was definitely something that I always had as far back as I can remember.
That's a really good self-reflection, I think. That part about being, likable and being able to adapt and be happy in a lot of circumstances certainly sounds like that would be you. And even just looking at your picture that you sent for us to put up in the show notes, you look at the picture and you go, oh, now there's someone I'd like to meet. You look very approachable. That's got to be something you're born with. But that desire to please others to the point where you lose yourself, that may have come from your environment. And I think it's also inbred in the society that although people are supposed to be so individualistic in this North American society, they're also supposed to please everyone, which is kind of a weird dilemma to be in.
Bit of a paradox there.
Yeah. I guess from what you've said so far, that building into personality would be overcoming the obstacles that stopped you from coming through authentically. And also, would that be from allowing other people in? What about that?
Can you ask that one again?
Part of your personality development was to be more authentically who you were rather than who you thought people wanted you to be so you could please them. What about letting people into your life? Was that part of your personality development as well?
Yeah. I don't believe I knew how to truly let people into my life at a deep level until recently. I was always really good, like we were talking about, is on the surface level, letting a lot of people in. It's being inclusive to people was always really important to me. I always wanted to invite people in, but letting them in at a deep level is really new to me. And I imagine it was a combination of the trusting, like if I let them in, it's safe to do so. And I'm not going to be hurt. I can trust them. My identity was shaped a lot around my role with others or my interaction with others. Like I was this entrepreneur. I was the captain of this team. It was all about the titles. I was the husband. I was this. And without those things, until recently, I didn't really know what my true self was. And so I think I resisted letting people in because the feeling of being seen without knowing what they're seeing it was a bit scary to me.
I really like what you just said about this idea of being the specific titles in that certain context, but then sort of being the sum of all those titles. And then if you take them away, do you know who you are? It's very interesting. That'd make a great blog article. So I wanted to ask you about a time when you felt that you went through kind of a cultural shock, where you realized that your assumptions were either completely wrong or where the context that you thought was normal was just not normal for everyone. It just happened to be for you. It seems to me you've been in a lot of situations where you're more or less the person who everyone wants to be with and who is chosen to be the natural leader. But there may be times when that hasn't been the case or when you ran up into resistance. And I'm just wondering what that might be. For example, in my family, people always said what they thought. They were way honest and not necessarily kind. It was more critical than honest, and people would be in a very witty way, sort of make fun of each other and then jump in and say stuff. And that really got me into trouble through life. And I realized that people didn't always take that as being funny and that it was hurtful. And then when I realized that and went back into my family context, I experienced that same dynamic completely differently. And I realized that what had been going on was really not that healthy, that it was really more of how can we criticize each other and make a joke out of it is not the same thing as laughing about foibles together is quite a different sort of a feeling. I did have some experiences where it just hit me that what I'd said, you could see the hurt on the faces and that had not been my intent. Yet when I think about it, maybe it was my intent because that's the way my family acted, right? So what was normally normal for that context wasn't normal for many other contexts, especially a workplace context.
Yeah, great example. And that actually brought up two experiences for me. One was in relation to like the leading. And for the first, 32 years of my life, I really viewed like the way that I was leading was that I had an answer and I could always provide an answer. And so what I often maybe unconsciously believed was that was the right answer. And so a lot of my coaching early on, a lot of my leading early on was just telling people what to do. It was like, oh, I have an answer. So let's go and let's do this thing. And it was a lot of telling people. And then somewhere when I started getting into this deeper work for myself, I started asking people questions about their experience and about what they thought about things and what they were feeling about. And it was this moment when I realized like, oh, not everyone thinks, feels, and acts the same way that I do. That was my first wake up that like, oh, people are viewing this very differently than me. And not only that, but just because I have one way doesn't mean it is the way. And that's when I started opening up to being wrong about a lot of things. And I don't really mean wrong, but just there's other options and there's other ways. And I think for the large majority of my life before that, I was just proceeding forward with like, oh, I know the answer. And that honestly limited me so much in my life because I had a very limited experience of life. But when I started asking other people about theirs, my awareness opened up. And I kept doing that. And I kept discovering that I really started noticing it in relationship with women in my life when I started asking them about their experience. And I started becoming more and more aware of how I was unconsciously interjecting my ideas and my actions into people's lives. And I didn't realize how abrasive it was to some people. And I've really made an intention to be much more aware of when I'm doing that. I think it's just a product of a true confidence in myself and in my leadership. And for a lot of times, I would just go forward with whatever I thought, and it always worked out in some way. And now I'm realizing like, okay, maybe slow down a little bit, like ask other people what they need, what's going on for them. And that really started to shift for me a couple of years ago.
Well, it will always be wrong if you only have
Yeah.
your own perspective because it's incorrect data. You don't have the data of everything around you. So incorrect data leads to incorrect assumptions and incorrect decisions. So we always think that because we have superior knowledge or confidence or education or something that puts us in a position of knowing, but we never know until we found out what other people are experiencing from their perspective. Like when, you were a 5-year-old experiencing feeling abandoned by your father, that was your perspective. That was entirely true to you. And so to say, well, that doesn't matter, just suck it up, that would take away from something that really helped to form you. So yeah, interesting. And I haven't asked you yet about your work in sort of helping men to do what you call embodied or somatic experience work. What does that mean? How did you get started in that area? What prompted you to go there?
When I started coaching, I started with what I knew, and that was very surface. And then as my own development got deeper or more expansive, I would just bring that into my coaching. And for the first 10 years of my own development and coaching, it was all what I would call mindset work. It was always in the conscious mind.
Which is less than 20% of your actions and beliefs and everything.
I've heard plenty of stats, but it's pretty low. It's very low. And and when I heard that, and when I started becoming even just aware that there was a lot that I didn't know or wasn't aware to yet. Again, it seems silly for me to say now, but like I lived a lot of my life not even being aware that that was a reality, that like the 80% of my actions, my thoughts, and my words, I wasn't actually consciously choosing them. They were just a conditioned pattern that was just playing out. And so when I started doing some deeper work for myself, the way I describe it, it didn't make sense in my mind. Like using the example, the story of me as a 5-year-old on the soccer field, that didn't make sense in my mind how that could possibly shape my entire life. My adult brain was like, no, that's a silly story. In fact, I resisted. I remember in the session that it came up, I resisted sharing it because I was like, oh, that's not it. That's silly. That doesn't make any sense. But it kept popping up and it kept popping up. And when I started going deeper into it, like you said, it's always surprising what shows up if we allow it to, that's impactful for us. And those traumatic events, the developmental traumas to our adult mind, they're not traumatic, but to a child, they absolutely can be. And those traumas are oftentimes stored in the body. We say in our work, like the body is the file cabinet and the mind just goes into the file cabinet to pull out these things. And so the work in somatics that we do is getting people out of their thinking mind and into their feeling body, to start feeling the sensations in their physical body, to feel the energy that's moving, to feel when you're triggered what is the thing that's coming up? Where do you feel it? What's the sensation like? And getting people to stay in that and release it at that level rather than going to the level of the mind, which is what's the story that you formed around this sensation? And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
Release it at the level of the initial experience, because we tend to just go right into, oh, that doesn't matter, or let's turn this into something positive, or things that stop you from actually looking at it and then checking out what the root is. And then it stays in your body and causes bodily pain frequently, right?
Yep.
I'm sure you deal
Yeah.
with that quite a bit.
Oh, so much, because it's all a form of resistance. So it's when we neglect to feel it at the level of sensation, we're literally resisting ourselves. We're rejecting the fact that this is there, and we're trying to manipulate. I call it mental gymnastics. We're like twisting and turning around this thing that's happening, and we're trying to make sense of it, or we're trying to create a story around it or make it positive. That's like one of the things that I laugh about in a lot of the spiritual or the personal development community is this like always positive mentality. It was, well, life isn't always positive. Like things happen.
You
Like,
can't get
yeah.
to the real positive until you've cleared the negative.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I still want to hear, like, why did this become the focus on masculinity and helping men? Where did that focus come from?
The shift toward the masculinity and really supporting men in their development came fairly natural to me. I realized that as I started coaching in Training Camp for the Soul, we do coach both men and women. But I realized that when I was guiding men through and we were going into these early childhood experiences, I just related so much. And it's like I understood it at such a deep level, much deeper than my mind could explain. And I understood a lot of the challenges of the collective masculine right now, because I was raised in it. Like my entire childhood was all masculine. It was all going and doing. And honestly, until recently, I didn't even understand the value of the feminine energy. And so I really understand a lot of I call it like the cultural squeeze with a lot of men, is that a lot of us were raised with certain programming that was just passed down and passed down. And a lot of men are coming up against the fact that they know that it doesn't serve them, but they don't have another model or example. They don't have a model for healthy communication, or for being vulnerable, or for sharing honestly, or for relaxing, for surrendering to life, for letting go a little bit of the tightly held control that most of us are taught. And so it just came really natural to me. And then I started getting into more of like the mind learning of it. And it all just made sense. Every book that I picked up on masculine development, on men's development, it all made sense to me. It's like I already knew it in my system. And I have such a compassion for it as well, because I lived 32 years of my life trying to play out the story that was sold to me. And it just never worked, and it never worked. And fortunately, I like to think that I'm in some ways on the other side of it and truly fulfilled. And I want everyone to feel that. I want everyone to feel like their full capacity of what they can experience in this lifetime.
Well, you won't ever really be on the other side, because it's always in relationship with other people. So when you're in relationship with other people, they will bring up things or trigger you in ways that you thought you might have already gotten past, or maybe you have, but not to that level, right? So it's like the process isn't like, okay, go from A to B and then you're done. It can go on for a while and related to other things. But it's interesting that you're doing that. And what you're saying reminds me a little bit of somebody that I interviewed recently. Her name is Sharina Mayani, and her podcast is coming live shortly. And she focuses only on working with women. And she said something very similar. She said it just felt so natural for her to work with women. She just felt it. It was just like that experience was the same experience she had, and it was the right path for her. And interesting that you would say that. She also works with men. You also work with women. But really that feeling of truly just understanding what men go through and moving through that with them in a way that they can trust you, I think is very valuable. Men need that. Women need that. We all need that.
We all need that. We absolutely do. And I think with a lot of men, one of the reasons that they do trust me is that I did have some credibility in that masculine world, and I did have some success in it. And I always explain it as I had just climbed to the top of a ladder. And when I looked down at all of the things that I had done and achieved, I didn't feel the way that I thought that I would or that I wanted to. And so it led me to seeking a different way. And I think for a lot of men, they resonate with that. A lot of them have been climbing their own proverbial ladders in some way, and they're not feeling the outcome that they really desire. And I believe for so many of us, it's just this feeling of empowered and connected and whole and fulfilled. It comes online for everyone whenever they're ready for it. But all of our journeys happen when they happen.
That's true. When I was in Japan, this is how this podcast got started. I was in Japan quite a few years ago, and I was doing international development studies with people from all over the world, and most of them were men from a lot of different countries that were war-torn. I was very interested in their experiences because they were devoted to peace, human rights, solving conflicts. I'm going, how did men in war-torn countries end up doing this kind of work? So I just got them to tell me their stories, and their stories were really similar in the sense that they all had a man that they admired who really came through for them in what I would call a more nurturing way. So the men they admired were economically successful. They had status in the community. They had education. And they also helped these men at some point in their lives, like actively, like they intervened to help them get a job. They got them their first computer. It might have been a father. In many cases, it wasn't a father. Sometimes it was a teacher or coach or an employer or an uncle, but it was a man who they admired, who believed in them. And it was really significant for them. So I think you being that person for other men, it's a huge calling.
That's beautiful. And I resonate, and that just feels so accurate that it really just takes one example, one model, one man, usually for another man, to give them permission, just to give that level of permission. And I'm fortunate that I've had many mentors and people in my life that have continued to give me that permission. And I'm just grateful to be able to do it for other men.
Mm-hmm. So a couple of quick questions here. So when people work with you, what's the best way for them to work with you? What brings out the best in you? As I know you're bringing out the best in them, but what brings out the best in you? What kinds of things are helpful for that?
I always say the more present I am, the more I am present in the whatever the thing that I'm doing, the more authentic I am, the more value I bring to whatever the session or the conversation or the podcast interview. And so my practice is breathing and slowing down and just getting as deeply into the present moment as possible. And when I do that, I laugh because things come through that I don't even know are there. When I slow down enough to really listen, to really pay attention to the subtleties of other people and their energy and their body language and my own as well. Magic happens. That's what I always describe it as magic happens. And that's when I'm at my best, is when I'm just deeply in the present moment. I get into what a lot of people call flow state when I'm facilitating. I'm not even there, and I'm just fully present, and we finish. And sometimes I don't even know what happened.
It's your soul experience, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe that.
And connecting with other people on that spirit level.
Mm-hmm.
They feel that you've seen them authentically, and they're seeing you authentically.
Mm-hmm.
So anything you'd like to promote or say, or let us know? We'll also put whatever you would like links into the show notes so people can look it up later.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Yeah, I always have programs going on. I lead retreats about 6 times a year between the Embodied Man program and Training Camp for the Soul. And we also have virtual programs that are going on all the time. The best way for people to find me is just go to chrismarhefka.com. And I always have like all my offerings on there. Yeah, I'd be so grateful for people to join me on this journey. And if this conversation resonates with them.
Awesome. That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And I would like to honor you for your courage and your willingness to be present to others and to be there for men, so that together we can have a so much more embodied experience of being a human being.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
Chris Marhefka is the CEO and facilitator at Training Camp for the Soul and the founder and facilitator of the Embodied Man Community Retreats. He came into his healing work after over a decade in entrepreneurship and coaching, choosing to work mostly with men Chris has discovered techniques for helping other men open their hearts, expand their minds, and be their true, authentic selves. It was great to interview Chris, and I hope you also enjoyed his interview and will share it with others. It is wonderful if you can share the podcast with one friend. If every one of our 5,000 listeners does this, we will certainly have 5,000 new listeners in very short order. Thank you for listening, and may culture and leadership connections continue to guide and inspire your day. This podcast would not be possible without the expertise of our Culture and Leadership Connections production team. A big thank you and shout out to Mike Kurlander for audio production and editing, to Malvika Kathpal for the show notes, Bernadette Guadiz for online web and social media management and promotions, Celine Bayogo for design, and Kirsten Hoyer for website and branding. Thank you so much. Are you a big Culture and Leadership Connections podcast fan? Our Patreon platform is the most versatile way to hear podcast episodes, cross-cutting theme discussions, and watch VIP podcast guest videos. You can download the app to your phone and listen wherever you are. Check out the subscription levels for perks that appeal to you. Feel good about helping us cover podcast production costs while enhancing your listening experience at the same time. Go to patreon.com/culture and leadership connections. That's spelled PATREON.com/culture and leadership connections.